A-level law, involuntary manslaughter. Now, there are two types of involuntary manslaughter. The first is unlawful act manslaughter, and the other is gross negligence manslaughter. UAM is defined as an unlawful criminal act which is dangerous and which causes the death of the victim. GNM, on the other hand, is described as a common law offence which can be committed via act or omission. During a scenario question, you will either be asked to do one or the other, or both of them, and you will have to differentiate between the two. The first part of unlawful act manslaughter is the act itself, and the killing must result from a specific act, not an omission. In cases where the death instead comes from an omission, you should pursue murder or gross negligence manslaughter as a criminal charge. Next, the act itself must be criminal, not civil. A civil wrong is not sufficient for pursuing a case of UAM, as shown specifically in the case of R.V. Franklin, where D threw their rubbish off a pier, which resulted in V's death. The act of throwing rubbish off a pier is considered civil, not criminal. Therefore, it was not sufficient. Then, it must be shown that the act itself was inherently dangerous, with the term dangerous being defined by an objective test from the case of R.V. Church, wherein a sober and reasonable person would recognize the risk of some harm occurring from the unlawful act. Recognition of serious harm, however, is not necessary. It also must be shown that the act itself causes the death explicitly. In some cases, the death may be purely coincidental. However, the main intrigue here are cases involving drugs, such as R.V. Kennedy and R.V. Cato. In the prior case, D supplied V with heroin, which resulted in V's death, making D's action the cause of the death, supplying the heroin. However, in R.V. Cato, despite the heroin being supplied, it was injected by someone else. So in R.V. Kennedy, V injected themselves, and D was held responsible. However, in R.V. Cato, D injected the other person, and the person who supplied them was not responsible for the death. Defining gross negligence manslaughter is different to UAM, as it's based more around duty of cares. It's a common law offence which can be committed via act or omission, similar to murder. It's originally defined by the case of R.V. Bateman, however, it was defined more recently in the case of R.V. Adamaco. The case revolves around an anaesthetist who failed to notice V's oxygen pipe was undone during a surgery. In the case, it was shown that the nurse held a duty of care to her patient and breached it grossly. It was also argued that a regular anaesthetist would have noticed much earlier, an estimated 10 to 15 seconds rather than the actual 4 minutes it took the defendant. It must lastly be stated that the risk to the victim must be of death and not of a simple injury. First, it must be shown that there was an actual duty of care between the victim and the defendant. In the scenario of Adamaco, for example, there is a duty of care between the nurse and her patient. There can also be duty of care between parents, guardians and children, or between a carer and their patient, or between a member of law enforcement and a civilian on the street, as that's their job, to help protect them. This also involves if you voluntarily take up care to help someone. For instance, in the case of R.V. Stone and Dobinson, where they voluntarily help them, but then if you don't supply the needed care and they die under that, you have breached the duty of care, which is shown in this part, the second part. It must be shown that the prior duty of care has not only been breached, but in a gross manner. For instance, as stated in the case of R.V. Adamaco by Lord Hewitt CJ, whether having regard to the risk of death involved, the conduct was so bad in all the circumstances as to amount in their judgment to a criminal act or omission. In the example case of R.V. Wacker, wherein a lorry driver held a duty of care to a number of immigrants he was escorting across the border, he closed the air vents, causing the majority to suffocate, which was deemed a gross breach of care as it resulted in numerous deaths.